Mel, hold on a minute. You're doing with a
What?
bottle of beer in your hand. That's completely anathema if we're talking about Islam. Am I not correct?
Jay, I love a beer as much as the next man, unless the next man is an Ottoman.
Ah, okay. Stay tuned. We're going to talk about that next. Well, here we've just talked about wine in Iran, and we pretty much showed that wine in Iran was actually not a problem. Shiraz, for 2,500 years, it has been a staple in Iran. And it looks like they're starting to come back to it again in some quarters, in some parts of Iran. But you just had a bottle of beer in your hand. A bottle of beer. Beer is also okay. Is this also part of Islamic tradition? Are you now going to shut down this notion that alcohol is prohibited, as we saw in chapter 2, verse 219, in chapter 5, verse 90, and verse 91 in the Quran? Also, Al Bukhari, volume 69, hadith number 481. We went through these verses, and in every case, it says very clearly that this is the work of Satan, that you're not to use it, you're not to imbibe in it, because it is the work of Satan, and that you won't even get to heaven if you continue to drink it. Certainly, that is what everybody has believed. That's what the Muslims have told us. Now, you're saying that, wait a minute, you can have a beer? Where? What place are you talking about? Over to you.
Well, Jay, I'm going to be talking about the Ottomans, Turkey. And apart from the fact that, like the Iranians, they liked their beer, they liked their wine, they actually gave us the word booze. The English heard that they had a beer in Istanbul, and it was called Boza, and hence they went back to England with the word booze. And there's an even more there's even more to this story, and it's a bit of a roller coaster ride. The Turks sometimes drank too much, sometimes they tried to prohibit it, usually in response to the fact that they were drinking excessively. But it never died away completely. There was a constant history right through the centuries, and that's what I'm going to look at now. So, Jay, we're going to be looking at three main areas. We're going to look at Turkey's checkered history with alcohol. We're going to see some observations of excessive drinking and the rise of temperance in Turkey in the 19th and 20th century. And we're going to look finally with the story of Boza Beer, which probably many of our viewers have never heard of. So let's start with Turkey's checkered history with alcohol. What this history will reveal is that despite what some Muslims would like to believe, Islam is a broad tent with a range of attitudes to alcohol. Christians likewise have different attitudes towards alcohol. Puritanism, whether in Islam or Christianity, does not represent the whole view or even the diversity of beliefs in both religions towards alcohol. How is it that so many Turks have gone on drinking since they were converted to Islam in the 9th and 10th centuries? Practicing the utmost discretion, drinkers regarded the spirit rather than the letter of the law. And what's interesting about the Turks is that they had a beer long before Islam, and when they headed west and took over Anatolia, they carried on drinking their beer, and it took a long time for this to be banned, not fully successfully, but it took quite a while. So there is a long history of connection with beer. So Jay, this is from this article down below. It refers to wine drinking in Ottoman Turkey, but it actually refers to both beer and wine, just so we're clear. Now, here's another interesting detail. Lady Wortley Montague, wife of the British ambassador in 1717, during one of her tete-a-tetes with Ahmed Bey, an Ottoman gentleman, says the following: Ahmed Bey made no scruple of deviating from some part of Muhammad's law by drinking wine with the same freedom that we did. So this is the 18th century. When I asked him how he came to allow himself that liberty, he made answer that all the creatures of God are good, and designed for the use of man. However, that the prohibition of wine was a very wise maxim and meant for the common people, being the source of all disorders amongst them, but that the Prophet never designed to confine those who knew how to use it with moderation. Nevertheless, he said that the scandal ought to be avoided and that he never drank it in public. So I think that really encapsulates the attitude in the 18th century to alcohol. It was something that if you were responsible and could drink it moderately, no problem. You didn't drink in public by and large, though there were exceptions to that, just to avoid the scandal, because people might interpret that you're drinking excessively. So that's how at least some Muslims would have viewed it in the 18th century in Turkey. Now we move on to a little bit earlier then, Selim II, a very interesting character from the 16th century. He was the most unrepentant heathen with a plethora of concubines and the palace a bustle with troops of dancers and musicians. While still heir to the throne, his friend Salal Bey warned him that his love of pleasure was eroding his authority and esteem. Draining his glass of wine, Selim replied, "I live for today and think not of tomorrow." One of his first acts as Sultan was to repeal the ban on wine imposed by his father, Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent. For the rest of his reign, drinking, in Istanbul at least, was entirely free of restraint. So you can see there was some attempt by his father to ban alcohol, but he basically turned that over immediately as soon as he took charge. I don't know if you want to come in on that.
Yeah, to come back on this, of course, people will say, yes, these are aberrations. These are not typical. And in fact, these are known because of the fact that he loved wine and he was seen as a debauched person. This is not a good support for your theory. I get that, and I understand that. I think what is the problem here is he went to excess. This is way beyond, because he was very much an unrepentant hedonist. If he's an unrepentant hedonist with a plethora of concubines and dancers and musicians and plenty of wine flowing in all directions, that's what they're against. It's the abuse of it. Nonetheless, it's obvious that his father banned it. He then did away with the ban. We just need to note that this was certainly used. It's not the fact that people today would say that this is the norm. This is not the norm. This is probably an aberration.
Aberration, yeah. Selim's attitude may have been a reaction to the excessive puritanism of his father, who at the instigation of an elderly advisor not only banned wine drinking to Muslims, but dismissed the palace dancers and musicians. He brought his wine drinking subjects to heel by legislating that drunks were to be punished by having melted lead poured down their throats. So this would suggest that actually he was responding to the prevalence of wine drinking among the public, rather than it being just to do with the palace and the what went on there. It seems that they had a problem, that the Turks were not just drinking alcohol, they were drinking excessively. 3 generations on, Ahmed I reinstated the ban lifted by Selim II, and in 613 ordered all the drinking houses in Istanbul to be demolished and kegs of all liquors smashed. As an aside, Selim II died in 1574 while drunk and bathing in his harem. So he didn't heed the advice of others who told him not to drink so much. Then we have Murad IV, who himself was a heavy drinker. So as you can see, what happened before didn't just end there. He went to the greatest extreme of all, walking around the streets of Istanbul in disguise, seeking out drunkards and having them executed on the spot, which is the height of hypocrisy. So he had the problem of drinking too much himself, but he hadn't much sympathy for others who had the same problem. Now, Muslims could always buy wine and raki discreetly from Jews and Christians. So even though they banned Muslims in Turkey from making it, there was no problem for Muslims to get hold of wine or raki if they wanted, as long as they didn't do it publicly. Apart from a brief attempt by Sultan Suleiman to totally prevent the sale of wine in Istanbul, Christians and Jews were always free to make, sell and drink wine and raki, an aniseed flavoured spirit. When in 1562 Suleiman imposed his ban, the Austrian ambassador pleaded to the pashas that if his retinue were denied wine, they would fall sick and perhaps die. I think he might have exaggerated a bit. Although the pashas argued that if the neighbours saw wine being brought to the embassy, it would arouse discontent to see Christians enjoying a privilege they themselves were denied, they finally gave in to his request for special dispensation, which meant that Muslims could also get hold of wine and raki as well, as we'll see later. Sani, a contemporary Turkish poet, voiced his objection to the ban in the following words: "The jars are broken, the goblet is empty, wine is no more. We are enslaved to coffee. Oh, what times these are." And then in the 19th century, when Ubissini visited the house of Osman Aga, a middle-class Istanbul gentleman, he reports, "Courteously, Osman Aga offered me a bottle of Bordeaux wine on a tray. Although he was strictly devout himself, he was not disturbed by the sight of wine. If I had refused to drink unless he did, I do not think he would have been able to refuse. The obligations of hospitality are as strict as those of religion." I don't know if you want to get in on that, Jay?
Yeah, I mean, most of the examples that we're seeing are aberrations or people that are going way beyond it's against the norm. In this case, it looks like Osman Aga offered a bottle of Bordeaux, which means certainly he had no problem with it, though he was strictly devout himself. So these are conflicting views, it looks like.
Yeah. I think there's a kind of like hypocrisy is probably the best word for it. Really, it's there's a public life and a private life that they were leading. It seems that a lot of Muslims were at least giving a nod to the public restrictions, and then what they did in private might have been a different thing. You know, I will see more evidence for that in a moment. A story that illustrates the Bektashi sect. So this is one Islamic sect. So that doesn't necessarily represent the whole of Islam, but it's another, if you like, community of Muslims that, you know, are worth listening to. One day, a Bektashi dervish went to the mosque and prayed to God to provide the money for a bottle of wine. The man beside him prayed for faith. After the prayers, the man turned accusingly on the dervish. "You heretic, are you not ashamed to ask God for money for wine?" Quite unmoved by this outburst, the dervish replied, "Everyone asks God for what he does not have. You have no faith, so you ask for that. Thanks be to God, my faith is intact. All I lack is money for wine, so that is what I asked for," which I thought was a fabulous little story. So it kind of goes to show that, you know, there wasn't just this one opinion which was anti-alcohol in Turkey. There was always a mixture of opinions and practices among the people. But despite the Sultan's attempt to outlaw alcohol amongst Muslims, Muslims continued to drink alcohol down through the centuries, often surreptitiously, as we'll see some evidence in just a while. So the second part today that we're going to look at is observations of excessive drinking and the rise of a temperance movement in Turkey in the 19th and 20th century. Now, temperance movements were not just happening in Turkey. They were happening in America, but they actually were happening in other places, such as in Ireland. Ireland had problems with excessive drinking, and there was a pioneer movement, something that I took part in myself as a youngster, and you had to make a vow to not touch alcohol till you were a certain age. And I think that's a very commendable thing, particularly to avoid excessive drinking. So this was something common across a lot of Europe and America as well. But here we go. So we have the evidence here of Horatio Southgate, an American missionary who spent years in the Ottoman Empire and Iran in the 1830s and 1840s. Here's what he says. All the intemperate Turks he knew in Istanbul, actually it's not what he said, but this is what's cited from him. All the intemperate Turks he knew in Istanbul were men who had acquainted themselves with Europeans, and some had even lived in Europe. Priding themselves on their knowledge of European manners, they drank often in excess. and sometimes for no other reason than to show their superiority to prejudice, often ridiculing those who didn't indulge, shaming them into succumbing to the habit. So what we've seen here is evidence that the Turks saw what the Europeans were doing and basically copied them. They were influenced in a bad way, I should add. And they picked up the worst habits from the Europeans, unfortunately. We also find evidence here of getting around the rules, which is one way of, getting around the prohibitions. New varieties such as cognac, raki, and beer, none of them mentioned in the Quran, offered such people the opportunity to have one's liquor and remain a believer. The same holds for champagne. Too tasty to pass up, it could easily pass for bubbly lemonade. Yet not wine but raki, made from grapes and aniseeds, became a common drink in the late 19th century Ottoman urban centres. So here's a statistic that's quite remarkable. In 1903, the annual consumption in Istanbul alone was estimated at 37,000 hectolitres, which is 3.7 million litres. That's quite a figure. So that means that it isn't just the tiny Christian or Jewish minority in Istanbul that were drinking alcohol, or even just the visitors. It must mean that quite a sizable part of the Muslim population in Istanbul were drinking at the turn of the 20th century. Do you want to come in on that, Jay?
Yeah, that shows right there that this was quite prevalent. Obviously, this is another aberration. It could be that's what we're looking at, people who did it surreptitiously. Obviously, this also could represent the foreigners that were there, the Europeans that lived in Istanbul and other big cities like Ankara. But it looks very clearly that certainly an awful lot of the Turks were also imbibing.
So we'll keep that question mark up about, is it just an aberration or is there more to it? In the third part of our video today, we're going to find evidence that it wasn't just an aberration, it was actually very common. So Henry Harris Jessup reports that at the turn of the 20th century, Turkish civil and military officers and the lowest class of boatmen and artisans drank as much as any Christian. So that's what he witnessed. That doesn't sound like an aberration, but it seems like it was pretty much commonplace, at least among that section of the population. So the West, on the one hand, had a negative effect, so which I'll detail here in this paragraph. The Allied occupation of Istanbul between 1920 and 1923 brought thousands of hard-drinking French, British, Italian, and Greek soldiers to the city. The arrival of a large white Russian refugee population following the Bolshevik Revolution had an even greater impact. There were dozens of Russian restaurants and drinking establishments. The vodka flowed freely in these establishments, and the hors d'oeuvres, zakuski, were served with drinks to customers ranging from high-class Turks in tuxedos to allied military officers. So clearly the West didn't have a particularly good impact on the Turks themselves there. So that, but the West also had a positive impact, just to balance things up. There was a sobriety campaign that was launched at the twilight years of the Ottoman Empire from 1919 to 1923. The antecedents of this movement are to be found in late 19th century medicalization of alcohol, whereas in earlier times, religious leaders had been the main opponents of drinking in Muslim societies. Resistance now also came from journalists and physicians who had studied or worked in Europe, or at least were familiar with European, mostly French ideas. From the 1880s onward, growing concerns about the physical and mental health of the body politic prompted these non-state actors to warn against the dangers of drinking alcohol, exhorting the state to take restrictive measures. At the core of their message was not religion, but health and hygiene. Okay. And then we have another influence, which was through a temperance movement in America called the Anti-Saloon League of America. Thinking globally, the ASLA in 1918 to 1919 formed an international task force. Its leadership saw Turkey, until the First World War, presumably a dry nation, as an ideal field of operation for its message, convinced that Muslims would welcome a total ban as prescribed by their religion, and welcome they did. Even the Sheikh ul-Islam of Istanbul, lamenting increased drinking in his country, hailed the American initiative as an ineluctable example for Islam. So they're obviously quite happy that the Americans were helping them to stop drinking, which is quite an irony considering we're talking about a Muslim population there. I don't know if you want to come in on that.
Yeah, I think all of these examples are exactly what I'm not surprised at. And that is that the true religious leaders, and certainly the leaders, even the political leaders, did not like the drinking, did not like the drunkenness because of what it did. That's why it seems to suggest that these are aberrations and nothing more than aberrations. The fact that even today, there are Muslims, I know, you know of Muslims who do drink and they drink to excess. There are Christians who drink to excess, and that is looked down, that's frowned upon. What we're looking for, though, is this something that is actually prescribed, or is this something that is actually evident in Islam in these countries rather than just aberrations? Are there people or are there institutions that actually functioned like we saw with Iran, that actually pushed it and actually were very good at it? Let's see what you have.
Okay, so you're really putting me to the test here. So what we're looking for now is
Right now,
evidence.
so far, you've just shown me aberration. You've shown me
Yeah.
temperance movements, which suggests that this was taken to an excess, and that's why the kickback. But that you haven't showed me that there is actually a group of people, or even an institution, or even like you had the Shiraz wine for Iran. You haven't showed me yet that this is actually endemic part of the whoop and woof of the country itself.
Okay, so let's see if I can do that in this third part.
Oh, you're going to try to do that.
Okay, yeah, exactly. So we're going to be looking at the story of Boza Beer. So Boza Beer, I mentioned booze at the beginning. Um, and so this is going to be an example of common Muslims drinking a low alcohol beer, and also that the sales of this alcohol were being used to fund the mosques themselves, right? So that's the mosques didn't refuse the money, so we seem to be quite comfortable with this. So we'll find out more now in just a moment. So the Hagia Sophia, or the Hagia Sophia as is sometimes called as well, was turned into a mosque by Mehmed II in 1453. The cost of its upkeep was paid for by beer, and I've put in tech beer there as a joke. The endowment of Hagia Sophia included 30 millet beer concessions. The beer's name Boza was quickly bastardized by visiting English sailors to booze. So I've got this from Istanbul, A Tale of Three Cities, history book by Bethany Hughes. So what was happening was beer was being sold in Istanbul, and the tax on that was being sent to the mosques, particularly this one, Hagia Sophia, and used to pay for the upkeep. So if there was a prohibition, it doesn't seem to be in evidence here. They seem to be very comfortable with using alcohol for Islam's benefit. I don't know if you want to jump in on that one.
Yeah. For those people who didn't get the joke there, take beer is similar to takbir, which is the call for praise. Whenever Muslims want to do a rallying call, they say takbir, and then they do the praise or whatever the call is. So you're doing a play on words there. Take beer instead of takbir. Well done. I don't think most people caught that. But yeah,
Oh,
certainly you can see that this is a case where you have a problem here. If the greatest mosque, the Hagia Sophia, which became a mosque in 1453, its upkeep was supported by beer itself, or the sale of beer, that seems to be an oxymoron. That seems to be a contradiction at its very foundations.
yeah. So what is Boza beer? It's fermented cereal flour, generally millet, drinks that have been produced in Anatolia and Mesopotamia since the 9th or 8th millennia BC. So we're talking a long time. There are references mentioning Boza like fermented ground millet drink in Akkadian and Sumerian texts. In the 10th century CE, the drink was called Boza and became common amongst Central Asian Turkic peoples. Later it spread to the Caucasus and the Balkans. It enjoyed its golden age under the Ottomans, and Boza making became a common trade in towns and cities. So this was not outlawed, this was very common, at least for centuries. We have reference here to the etymology of Boza. One suggestion is that Boza comes from the word bouze, I think you might pronounce it, or booze, which means millet in Farsi language. There are Boza-related names given to streets around Istanbul, which illustrates the popularity of Boza throughout history. Again, this is more evidence of the prevalence of alcohol in Turkish society down through the centuries. We also have the drink being drunk by the janissaries. Boza was widely drunk by the janissaries in the army. It contained only a low level of alcohol, so we're not talking about necessarily excessive drinking here. So as long as it was not consumed in sufficient quantities to cause drunkenness, it was tolerated as a warming and strengthening beverage for soldiers. So these are the soldiers that were fighting on behalf of the Sultan himself, and it was common amongst them. So this would be almost like the religious police of Iran drinking alcohol. So that says a lot, I think. Now, the Janissaries did drink sometimes to excess, but as long as they didn't, it was okay, and pretty much the whole of society, with the exception of maybe a religious minority within society that didn't drink alcohol, it would have been pretty similar to the rest of Europe at that time. Evliya explained in the first volume, Istanbul, of his travelogues, these Boza makers are numerous in the army. To drink sufficient Boza to cause intoxication is sinful, but unlike wine, in small quantities, it is not condemned. So there's clearly a prevalence of it, and the rule was simply, as long as you don't drink in excess, you're good to go. So that was what happened, at least for quite a while. Until the 16th century, Boza was drunk freely everywhere, but the custom of making the so-called tartar Boza laced with opium brought the wrath of the authorities down on the drink, and it was prohibited by Sultan Selim II, who we saw earlier, the guy who was a heavy drinker. Clearly the addition of opium was a step too far even for him. So, it was pretty prevalent. In the 17th century, Sultan Mehmed IV prohibited alcoholic drinks, including Boza, and closed down all the Boza shops. This prohibition would be reinforced and then loosened several times in the history of the empire. In the 17th century, Turkish traveller Evliya reports that Boza was widely drunk at this time, and there were 300 Boza shops employing over 1,000 people in Istanbul alone. Okay, so that shows quite an openness to alcohol, certainly in the 17th century there, prior to the prohibition. And then finally, in the 19th century, the sweet and non-alcoholic Boza preferred at the Ottoman palace became increasingly popular, while the sour and alcoholic type of Boza went out of style. But it wasn't that they stopped drinking alcohol. Raki became the popular alcoholic drink amongst the Turks. So, so it's quite a mixed.
Yeah, this is fascinating. I was skeptical when you began with this, because I said, okay, this is not like the Iranian one, because the Iranian one, the Shiraz, actually was part of the whole court system. It was very much a carryover from the Zoroastrianism and carried right into Islam, and Islam really just incorporated it and brought it within it, certainly up until the 14th century. So that was conclusive proof that alcohol was quite readily available, especially wine. Now in Turkey, you're trying to make the same point, but I was not at all influenced by your viewpoints, because almost every example you gave was an aberration, was an over people. You have this guy named Selim II, who overturned his father's prohibition against it because he was a drunkard himself. In fact, he died as a drunkard in a bath. So, not a very good example of this, of the applicability of alcohol in Islam. You went on to Murad IV, who was also a heavy drinker, though he went around and executed those who were drinking, I guess because he wanted to show that he was against it. But then you came to the 1800s and the 1900s, and you went into the Ubisini, who was offered by Asa Osman a drink, and actually this was quite normal. And this is looked like at that time it was being brought back, or at least in this case, it was not seen as an aberration. You talked about the influence of the West and how they brought in the temperance movement. You can't have a temperance movement unless there's a problem. But again, the problem is not the drinking itself. The problem is overindulgence. That's what temperance movements is all about. It's not saying don't drink. It's just saying don't drink in excess. And so temperance, bringing in from the West, suggests that this was being done. What really persuaded me, though, is when you finally got into the third section of your talk, where you talked about the Boza Beer. The Boza Beer, which has its antecedents all the way back to the ninth millennium, which is 9,000 BC. How they can come up with those kind of dates, I don't know. Nonetheless, it looks like it's prehistory. Boza Beer has been around in that part of the world, and its influence continued on. What I thought was fascinating is how you talked about Elia Chalebi, who referred to the fact that this is really what the military use. The military are the authorities for the whole state. If the military were using it and they saw it in the Janissary Corps, remember the Janissary Corps are the elite forces that were there to protect the Sultan. Interestingly, the Janissary Corps are made up of Christian boys who then were permitted to continue to use it, though they had converted to Islam. If they were permitted to use it, and this was used right across the military, in fact, it looked like the military even helped produce it, that would suggest that this was pretty well acceptable during the Ottoman period. So the Ottomans, beginning certainly with the big Ottoman period, there was beer drunk everywhere. The temperance movement then makes sense why the temperance movement had to be brought in the 18th, 19th century, because it was so readily available and there was so much usage of it. You talked about 3.7 million liters were drunk in 1903 alone. That's a lot of beer, folks. No wonder they needed a temperance movement. But this suggests that both in Iran and now I'm convinced in Turkey, there was people that were not only looking away from people that drank, they also participated themselves. And the real only problem with it was not that alcohol was bad in and of itself. The excess of it, the fact that people getting drunk with it, the fact people were hurting others because of it. That's what people were against. And we have the same thing in Christianity. Isn't that interesting? We don't have people, yeah. Not an induction. There is not an injunction against drinking wine. Paul tells Timothy to drink wine. Jesus made wine. It was his first miracle, the best of wines. So certainly in Christianity, we can drink wine. What we aren't permitted to do is to get drunk or is to get inebriated. Fascinating. But this goes on what you're praying here, both in the Iran and Turkey. This goes against what Muslims are saying today. Well done. Like this. Any last words you have?
Yeah, you mentioned that the Janissaries continued drinking alcohol. They were Christians and so forth. But actually, when they came to Turkey, they were just young boys by and large. I think the older it would have been 16. So they would have been anything from 8 up to 16. They wouldn't have had any experience of drinking alcohol. They were quickly converted to Islam. And they were molded into fully fledged Muslims. So it wasn't that they were bringing the Christian practice of drinking alcohol along with them. They didn't have any experience of it, so they were picking that up. Yeah,
even better. That makes it even more solidified. Now, after we did this recording, Mel sent me some new material that he'd come across, and I just wanted to add this in as an addendum. Looking at Turkey today, it's proving to be a world leader in beer production. So even today, this has continued. The Anadolu Efes, here's a picture of it, of the beer, Efes beer, it's probably best known for. It is the 5th largest beer company in Europe and the 9th largest in the world in terms of production, volume. So it is not an insignificant beer. Here's a map. Take a look at the map here and look at all the different places where they have their breweries all over Europe and also over to the east. And all those places in the east, those are all Islamic countries, and yet they're brewing this Turkish beer. In Turkey itself, they have 3 breweries that are of note, 2 malt production plants and 1 malt plant. And Turks drink, on an average, 11 liters of beer per person per year. So not at all insignificant. That's on average. All Turks, of course, not all Turks drink. So the ones that do drink a lot more than 11 liters. Here is a picture of, or a map of where the wine is drunk. So it's not just beer in Turkey. That's a map of Turkey. And if you look at them, look at the wine regions. Those are still ongoing regions where they grow wine and produce it along with beer that we've been talking about. If we move to Algeria, again, another very strict Muslim country, during or just prior to the Algerian War of Independence in 1954 to 1962, is a long war. Algerian wine, along with that of Morocco and Tunisia, accounted for nearly 2/3 of the total international wine trade. Let me repeat that. 2/3 of the total. That's not just of that area. That's the whole world. International wine trade came primarily from Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, all of which are strong Muslim countries. So certainly in the 20th century, it's very clear that you had an enormous amount of alcohol consumption. Here is a map of Algeria. It has as much land under vineyards in just their country, and this the country of Algeria, as the countries of Germany and South Africa combined. And Algeria continues to maintain a wine industry with over 70 wineries in operation. What about this prohibition against alcohol? This is, when Mel sent me this, I had no idea that they were so steeped in alcohol in these very traditional and ongoing Muslim countries. Algerian wines are characterized by their overripe fruit, high alcohol, and low acidity. You notice we bolded it in high alcohol because these are not just cheap wines. These are very highly alkalized or alcoholized wines. Now let's go to Libya. Libya right next door. In the year 2013, 1,000 people were hospitalized from alcohol poisoning due to unregulated bootleg alcohol laced with methanol. And here is a report from the 16th of April. Last month, this report says Libya's capital witnessed one of the largest recorded outbreaks of alcohol poisoning anywhere in the world, during which over 1,000 people were hospitalized and more than 100 were killed or died because of the poisoning. The mass poisoning was caused by methanol, and over a period of about 1 week, Tripoli's hospitals were in a state of emergency as they were flooded with patients suffering from symptoms such as blindness, brain damage, and kidney failure. Methanol is thought to have been mixed with the locally brewed spirit known as Boca, much like the Boza Beer that we heard about earlier. But so far, the authorities have little information about who was responsible and just how many sources of Boca were contaminated. This map that I have here kind of says it all. Look at these beers, these different emblems of beers, and which are the most popular in every one of these Muslim countries. Folks, you cannot tell me that beer and wine are not used in Muslim countries. Oh, they may have a religious edict against it. We have seen the verses about it. But when you look at what's happening even today, I'm just showing you, this is a modern map. These are the beers that are used and consumed in huge quantities all over the Muslim world. So though the Muslims will tell you they're against alcohol, what they say and what they do are totally two different things. Well done. Thank you for this. It looks like in everything we're finding, and folks, are you seeing this? Everything that Mel's coming up with, the other sin sifters are coming up with, we are the sin sifters. We're looking at the standard Islamic narrative and we're sifting these different categories, and we're finding that what comes out the bottom is not what Muslims have been telling us, is not what Islam seems to support. It's finding that there's a completely different story. Here is another story. Well, like we've done with paintings, like we've done with art, like we've done with many of these, what were considered to be sacrosanct from the very beginning, like we've looked all with the coins, and we've looked at also at the artifacts, and we've looked at the buildings, and we looked at the rock inscriptions. What standard Islamic narrative is telling us when you look back in the 7th, 8th, and 9th century is not what the 7th and 8th and 9th century are telling us. It's a completely different story. And we're shooting holes in this story. These are holes in the narrative. What narrative? The standard Islamic narrative. We're shooting holes. Here's another one. We've been told that this is sacrosanct. You do not touch alcohol. You don't even drink one drop. It looks like Muslims were not quite cognizant of that at the very beginning. And certainly it might suggest that much of these Quranic or injunctions against it were probably added at a later date. More to how that will be coming up as we unpack the Quran. Thanks so much. This has been terrific. Mel, you're right on board again. It's so much to hear from you. We look forward to the next time you come and join us. Great. Mel and Jake, thousands of miles apart. Over and out.